Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents F is for Fake Marriage by Annie J. Rose. Narrated by Wayne Mitchell and Meghan Kelly. Chapter 1. Toby. Paris had had more of an effect on me than I thought it would. I'm back home in New York. I got accustomed to the way Maddie made me feel. Telling myself a relationship in the office was a terrible idea, I got used to the tug in my stomach when I saw her leaned over a table and the shiver of desire when she smiled at me. It was a constant state of attraction that simmered just beneath the surface, and I never once acted on it. I doubted she even knew what I was feeling. At least, she hasn't known for long. But then the marketing team decided to do the photo shoots for our most recent campaign in Paris. The City of Lights was widely considered the most romantic place in the world. It was perfect for the fresh, modern, and edgy marketing campaign we wanted for the app I'd developed. It was a suggestion of Jane, the newest member of the marketing department, that we all started envisioning the pictures being taken on the streets of Paris. The sketches she drew for the campaign were impressive enough to catch the attention of Nick Nygaard, the wealthy businessman who'd recently merged my company into his. She had a vision for the campaign, and it was nothing short of extraordinary. Compelling and instantly influential, it combined the dynamic contemporary edge with the history and fantasy dreamscape of Paris. It was exactly what we needed to create a launch for my app that would take the world by storm. When we first started talking about taking the trip, my mind was completely on the photographs and how they would work with the rest of the campaign we planned. It wasn't long before I started thinking about spending the time there with Maddie. I knew it wouldn't be easy being surrounded by the romantic aura of the city. I knew it would be even more difficult when I heard we wouldn't be staying in several hotel rooms, but all sharing one large apartment so we would be close together. Sharing the space with her and knowing she was so close was going to make my attraction to her even more difficult to resist, but I thought I could do it. I thought I'd be strong enough to push those feelings down and focus completely on work. Obviously, I was wrong. As my fingers combed back through her glossy hair and my mouth eagerly sucked her plush bottom lip in between my own, I knew my expectations of myself were far off. There was no way I was going to be able to get through this trip without getting my hands on her. I needed to taste her, feel her body, and hold her in my arms. My control held out almost the entire week. Being on a breakneck schedule that kept us running essentially from the moment we got up until we fell on our faces asleep at night helped, but that didn't stop the dirty thoughts and longing looks. I lusted after Maddie from the day I hired her, and being in such close quarters with her condensed all those thoughts and feelings down into an intense need I couldn't resist. The connection between us grew throughout the week. Stolen glances and shared smiles turned to small touches when no one was looking, brushing up against each other accidentally on purpose, and me finding as many ways as possible to work even more closely with her. Every day I found new ways to be near her, and all those tiny moments finally erupted. The night before we stayed up late after the others went to bed, but instead of working, we ended up making out furiously on the couch. It wasn't enough, because it only made us hungrier for each other, and it was all I could do to get to the end of the day. We stayed as close as possible to each other through the photo shoot, touched at every chance we got, and even made it through lunch pressed close together at a tiny table. Nick's invitation for us all to go to a celebratory dinner together was the last straw. Slipping into the back of a cab, we were barely out of sight of the cafe where we left Jane and Nick before we were tangled together. The excuses we gave them were weak, but neither of us could stand the thought of wasting our last night in Paris. If there was ever going to be a moment when we would give in to the boiling heat between us, this was it. And we weren't letting a second slip through our fingers. The night before, Maddie broke us apart and told us we had to stop. She reminded me that a relationship between us was against company policy. It was enough to stop us then. But as soon as we saw each other that morning, we couldn't keep our hands off each other. Sneaking in the touches on each other throughout the day when no one was watching only made me hotter and needier, and I knew I couldn't hold out much longer. Now we'd finally made an excuse to get away from Nick and Jane, and were alone together. I was finally going to have her. Maddie and I were going to make passionate love, and I couldn't be more excited. I wasn't going to let myself think about anything but this moment. I pushed aside what she'd said to me the night before and any concerns that lingered in my mind. We weren't in New York. We weren't in the office, and nobody else was around. This was the romance and fantasy of Paris, and we were letting it take over. I wanted her more than I had ever wanted anything or anyone, and I was willing to ignore reality to enjoy her for as long as I had the chance. In the seconds between me getting into the cab and kissing Maddie, I gave the driver an address. When we pulled up in front of the hotel, it was just as beautiful and elegant as I hoped. And that's what Maddie deserved. Even if I could only be with her for one night, I wanted to give her everything I could. I got out of the cab and reached in to help her out. After paying the driver, I wrapped my arm around Maddie's waist and hurried her inside. She leaned against me at the counter as I checked in, asking for their best suite. The clerk eyed us, then glanced down at our hands as if looking for luggage. We didn't have any, and she gave a knowing smile before handing over the key. I took it gratefully, and Maddie and I rushed across the lobby to the elevator. The ride seemed to take forever. I forced myself not to push her up against the wall and start undressing her right there. When the doors finally opened, I took Maddie's hand and we headed down the hallway together. She stopped me after a few feet and pulled me to her for another deep kiss before scurrying away. I chased after her, grabbing her from behind and spinning her around in my arms to kiss her again. She laughed as we continued toward our room. Finally, we made it to the door, and I swiped the key card. It opened, and we tumbled through together. At last, we were alone together behind a closed and locked door. The silence was thrilling. Finally, blessed privacy. I put my hands on Maddie's waist and leaned in for another kiss, but she pulled back. Her deep blue eyes locked on mine, and she stared at me intently, as if making sure I was paying careful attention to what she was going to say. "Remember, this is just tonight, a one-time fling," she said. "I know," I told her, nodding as I leaned toward her again. Maddie flattened her hand in the middle of my chest and pushed me back again. "And when we get back to New York, it's like it never happened. We go right back to the way we were before we came here, working alongside each other and nothing else," she reiterated. "Yes," I told her, nodding again as I swallowed down the doubts of my ability to actually stop desiring her whether we were in New York or not. My confirmation was enough for Maddie. She threw her arms around my neck and kissed me passionately. I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her up hard against me. Lifting her off her feet, I carried her over to the bed and set her down on the end of the mattress. And getting down on my knees in front of her, I lifted one foot and took off her shoe, and then took off the other. I moved forward, pushing her thighs apart so I could gather her against me again. Our mouths met, and we kissed for another few seconds before I pulled back to continue undressing her. Using my fingers to gather her shirt, I pulled the hem from the waistband of her pants and slid my hands up her to feel the ripple of her ribcage beneath her skin. Maddie lifted her arms, and I pushed the shirt up and off. Her pale pink bra perfectly cupped her full breasts, and I leaned down to nuzzle my face between them. Her soft skin was flushed and felt warm against my lips. I swept my tongue across one slope and then the other as Maddie's fingers dug into my hair. She pressed her hips forward to grind harder against my chest. Bringing my mouth back to hers, I kissed her deeply and released the button of her pants. The zipper went down, and she lifted her hips so I could pull the tight jeans from her hips and down her legs. And backing up as I went, I tugged them the rest of the way off and tossed them aside. Maddie grabbed the front of my shirt and pulled me up to my feet in front of her. Sliding to the very edge of the bed, she went to work on my belt, then the button and zipper of my pants. As she took them down, I stepped out of my shoes and threw my shirt over to join her clothes. I wrapped one arm around her waist and scooped her up so I could move us both higher on the bed. My body stretched out over hers, and our mouths crushed against each other. Maddie moaned into my mouth, and her hips rocked beneath me. In one movement, I rolled over onto my back and positioned her to straddle me. She reached behind and unhooked her bra. The lacy fabric popped away from her body, and I groaned as I lifted my hands to massage into her soft, bare breasts. Her nipples tightened beneath my touch, pressing into my palms. Maddie arched into my hands and moved her hand behind her to run her hand over the bulge of my hardening erection. I looped my thumbs in the waistband of my boxers to shuck them, and she raised her hips to let me move her panties out of the way. She sat back and stretched her legs out, letting me lead the damp scrap of fabric off her feet. She started to tuck her legs back under her, but I stopped her, holding them in place, and then pressing her thighs apart. I bent my knees so she could lean back on them and paused to let my eyes rove over her, taking in every gorgeous inch of her body. I touched my hand to the middle of her chest and drew it down her belly to her navel. My fingertip dipped down into it before continuing down to her hip bones. Her head fell back, and her muscles trembled as I traced my fingers from one hip over to the other. My touch moved back and forth, sweeping lower with each pass. She gasped, and her thighs opened a little farther, inviting me to touch her. It didn't take much coaxing. I let my hand trail down the rest of her stomach and finally found her slick, wet heat.
Chapter 2. Maddie. My mouth opened, and I drew in a sharp breath at the feeling of Toby's fingers slipping across my already taut, sensitive peak. The chemistry between us and the slow burn of the week together kept my body in a perpetual state of arousal, and now the need was paying off. It was obvious Toby could feel how ready I was for his touch. He groaned when he felt the slickness of my body across his fingers, and the sound only increased the rush. Toby swirled his fingertips around my clit, using pressure so perfect it was like he already knew every detail of my body. The wave of intense pleasure sent a thrill through my body that settled right between my thighs. The position he put me in was completely new, and the experience of it almost overwhelmed me. I'd never been that free and open with a man. Facing him with my thighs open and my legs on either side of him, I should have felt vulnerable and exposed, but I didn't. There was no hesitation or embarrassment. I didn't want to cover up or reposition myself so he couldn't see me. I relished the feeling of his eyes drinking me in. I wanted him to memorize every inch of me and build the intensity I felt low in my belly. I wanted Toby to feel the same powerful draw I was experiencing and crave a connection so explosive it would leave both of us unable to forget it, even as we put it behind us. He explored me further, tracing every curve and dip until I was shaking with anticipation. When his fingers sank into me, my body lit up and I cried out. My hips pushed down against his hand, wanting more of him. It wasn't enough to just have that feeling. I needed more. Toby turned his hand and settled the pad of his thumb onto my clit again. The combination of his fingers sliding slowly against my inner walls and his thumb applying just the perfect pressure to my intensely sensitive pearl sent me instantly spiraling. There was no way I was going to be able to maintain my control for long. He was pushing me to levels of pleasure I'd never experienced, and I didn't want to miss any of it. Closing my eyes, I let my head fall back and my thighs completely open. My hips rocked against his hand almost involuntarily, my body completely taking over. Tension started building in the tips of my fingers and the bottom of my feet. Heat burned across my face, and my muscles shook and trembled. I didn't try to hold back. I let the power of the feelings rush through me, and my orgasm set my body aflame. Toby held his fingers deep inside me and pressed the other hand to the frantic beating of my heart as I rode the waves of climax. I could feel his thick, hard cock pressing against my back, and even as I came down from the intense peak, I knew I wasn't done. I wanted so much more. Reading my mind, he lowered his legs, scooped me up against him, and rolled me onto my back. We landed with his hips nestled between my thighs and the tip of his hard cock nudging my still-tingling opening. I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled him down for a kiss. Our mouths played across each other. Toby positioned his hips and eased forward. The sensation of him filling me fully and completely was even better than I could have imagined. I clung to him, wanting every bit of my body to touch his. There was a dizzying, almost indescribable feeling of desperation mixed with the fulfillment. Like he was everything, and yet I couldn't get enough. Toby held himself in place for only a few seconds before his hips started to move. His thrusts were strong and insistent, but not demanding or forceful. They let me concentrate on the delicious glide of him across every intimate bit, discovering places no one had ever touched. The first climax softened and heated my body, so I was ready to accept all of him, and Toby didn't relent. Just when I thought I couldn't get any more pleasure, he lifted one of my legs and propped it on his shoulder. Holding himself up on his hands on either side of me for leverage, he created a new angle that delivered a wave of deeper, more explosive sensations. I held on to his shoulders and kissed him eagerly. Our bodies found a rhythm, and everything else in the world disappeared around us. Even as Toby ran a trail of kisses down the side of my neck and brushed the tip of his tongue across my skin, I could hardly wrap my head around what was happening. I couldn't believe I was having sex with my boss, but at the same time, I couldn't help myself. This was too incredible. There was no way I was letting my logic get in the way and stop me from tumbling down this delirious whirlpool. Toby's grunts and groans got louder and more intense as he picked up speed. Our bodies climbed together, and I could feel the rush of another climax coming through my body. We held on tight to each other, and at the same moment my body crashed, and his cock pulsed and throbbed inside me. Each tight clench of my walls drew him deeper, milking him and connecting us more. I clawed at his back, and he bit down on my bottom lip until we both finally collapsed, gasping for breath. His skin was slick with sweat, and I tasted some of it, enjoying the saltiness on my tongue. Toby nuzzled his head into the curve of my neck and shoulder and kissed the tender spot there. One hand trailed along my side, then slipped beneath me to gather me close so he could fall to the side and curl around me. We lay there silently for several long minutes, our hands lazily tracing across slick skin and our mouths occasionally finding each other for languid kisses. Our breaths slowed and calmed as our bodies drifted down from the peak and settled back to normal. There was no need to say anything, not at that moment. It was enough to just be in the bubble with him. I was surprised by how good it felt to just lie there in his arms. I didn't want to move, didn't want anything else but to feel the warmth of his skin and listen to his breath and heartbeat. He was truly a remarkable man. I wouldn't admit it to him, but that was a fairly new revelation for me. I wasn't immediately enraptured by him or as impressed as other people seemed to be. When I first went to him to interview for the job in the marketing department of his company, he didn't seem all that special. If anything, it was frustrating to see his success. I thought he was nothing more than a computer nerd who'd stumbled into a business and now had everything he could have ever dreamed of drop right in his lap. Then he'd hired me, and the more we worked together, the more I learned about him. I realized my initial impression of him wasn't at all the truth. Toby worked hard for everything he had. He was very smart and extremely good at what he did, but he was also compassionate and funny. He really cared about the people around him and wanted to make sure he was creating a company that benefited more than just him. He was really a great catch. Too bad he was my boss, and I'd have to let him go. That thought coming into my mind and swelling until it took up every corner and recess was enough to sour the afterglow. The bubble around us burst, and I had to face reality again. Letting out a sigh, I peeled myself away from Toby and climbed out of bed. If I let myself lie there for another few seconds, I would want to be there for the rest of the night, and that just wasn't something we could do. It was better to end it now so we didn't get any deeper. Toby's fingertips brushed along my lower back as he reached for me, but I forced myself to ignore the touch and get up. My clothes were scattered around the room, and I walked around gathering them up. I could feel his eyes on me. It seemed strange, but the feeling of that look was different now. There was a distinct separation between the way it felt when he looked at me for the first time, seeing my body presented to him, and now that we'd fully experienced each other. It was deeper and more intense, and I could feel it on me even as I walked into the bathroom to put myself back together. Several minutes later, I came back out. He was still lying in bed, covered to his hips with a sheet as he reclined on the pillows. It was an enticing scene, and I was almost tempted enough to peel off my clothes again and crawl back in with him. Instead, I concentrated on putting on my shoes. "You don't have to rush off," Toby said from the bed. I put on my second shoe and straightened, trying to fluff my hair back up. "Nick and Jane will be waiting for us," I reminded him. "They went to dinner, and they think each of us were off doing different things, but they aren't going to think they'll take all night." Some of the sleepy contentment disappeared from his face as that sank in. Toby started to flip the sheet back so he could stand up, but I waved him away. "You don't need to get up yet. Just relax for a while. Order some room service or something," I told him. Toby looked at me strangely. "What?" "We're supposed to be in 2 different places, remember? It wouldn't look good for the 2 of us to show back up at the apartment together. We should leave separately and arrive at different times," I said. He nodded. "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." "Great. I'll go first." Suddenly things got awkward. This wasn't exactly a moment I'd thought all the way through when tangled up in the back of the cab with Toby. Thanks for the great time tonight." I cringed and turned away, heading for the door as fast as I could without breaking out into a full run. I didn't need to hear whatever he was going to come up with to answer the absurd stream of words that just tumbled out of my mouth. Hurrying through the lobby, I didn't make eye contact with anyone, especially not the clerk at the desk who had known exactly why we were checking in. There was mercifully a cab already waiting at the front of the hotel, and I dove inside it. The driver looked at me in the rearview mirror, and I gave him the address of the apartment. Dropping my head back against the headrest, I stared at the ceiling of the cab and silently chastised myself. Embarrassment burned on my face and chest the entire drive through the city. Like I expected, the cab stopped on a side road rather than actually going to the front of the apartment. The entrance was down a narrow cobblestone road off an alley too tight for cars to go down comfortably. Somehow, climbing out of the cab and taking the walk to the apartment just made my embarrassment worse. As soon as I got inside the apartment, I hurried to the bathroom. I took a long hot shower and got into my favorite baggy pajamas before stuffing myself under my covers and pulling them up to my chin. I squeezed my eyes closed, but it wasn't any use. An hour later, I still couldn't sleep as the memories of what happened with Toby replayed through my head over and over again.
Chapter 3. Toby. It was amazing how much could change in less than a year. It was a theme that had repeated itself several times recently in my life, but 7 months after coming back from the business trip in Paris, the differences were more pronounced. Not all of them were bad. Being back in New York was comfortable. It was home and familiar, unlike the streets of Paris, which didn't seem completely real despite how long we spent there. The highlight of those 7 months was definitely the launch of the new ad campaign. We worked ourselves into the ground in the days and weeks after getting back to make sure every detail was put in place. The final result of the photo shoot and Jane's artwork was nothing short of spectacular. It was far more than I ever could have imagined, and even Nick was impressed. That was no minor feat. When it came to marketing and creating a company image, Nick Nygaard had seen it all, done it all, and probably pioneered the vast majority of it. But Jane took him by surprise, creating a layered marketing approach that appealed to a massive range of consumers across various mediums. It was a tremendous amount of work, and the anxiety leading up to the launch was real. Everything balanced on that campaign. My company had already been around for several years, but I hadn't been able to make much of it. Catching Nick's attention and having him agree to merge with me and boost my app was a once-in-a-lifetime dream, but just having his name behind my software wasn't enough to really make it a success. It was all centered on how well we could reach out to the target demographic and convince them to accept my company. This ad campaign was my one shot. If it was successful, it could launch my company into massive success and get the momentum rolling so I could keep growing. If it failed, everything I'd worked so hard for would crumble around me. Fortunately, it was an instant and astonishing hit. What wasn't so fortunate was Jane not being around to enjoy it with us. She resigned a few weeks after we all got back to New York, and the office was definitely feeling the loss of the marketing department's star employee. It was affecting Maddie particularly hard. The two of them had grown close working together, and Maddie seemed sad not having her friend around every day. Some of the spark was sucked out of her, and she didn't seem as motivated without Jane to bounce ideas off. It was hard to see her that way, especially because I couldn't say anything to her. She did her best to cover it up and never said anything outright. I only noticed because I wasn't even close to being over her. We agreed in Paris we weren't going to acknowledge anything between us when we got home. We were taking a Vegas approach to the whole situation. What happened there stayed there, and that's just the way it was. This was far easier said than done. We hadn't said a word to each other about our night together since the plane touched down, but that didn't mean I wasn't thinking about it. Maddie wasn't so easy to compartmentalize. I held my thoughts and feelings to myself, but I still lusted after her obsessively. She filled my mind, dominated my thoughts. I watched her from a distance, keeping an eye on her, but maintaining our professional relationship just as we agreed. Her sadness after Jane left was difficult to deal with. The entire marketing
Sample complete. Ready to continue?